Look, this dialogue brings together people from across the Pacific and Australia to hear from one of Australia's leading experts, and I would actually say the leading expert on optimism, Victor Perton. And I'm personally very excited to be here today. I've been waiting for this dialogue to come along. I think it's one of the more exciting ones that we've had. Our dialogues create business opportunities. They let you reconnect with old friends and make new ones and expand your networks. We believe that practical projects are the catalyst for relationships to form and endure. I encourage you all to be brave today, to take every opportunity that's presented and look for opportunities to actively contribute. Unfortunately, our advertised facilitator, Salote, had to withdraw at the last moment, and I'm sure a number of you will probably know why. However, I'm pleased to advise that Catherine has kindly agreed to step into the role, and Catherine's very familiar to many of you, or most of you. She will conduct a one-on-one style interview style with Victor, and afterwards you'll be given the opportunity to ask questions. Please use the chat function to ask your question. This is probably a good opportunity or a good time to remind you of our Zoom etiquette. Can you please make sure you're on mute unless you're speaking? Also, if you could make sure your name and country is on your Zoom screen, for example, Simone-Host. That will make it easier for Catherine and Victor to identify who is asking the questions. When you want to ask a question, please type your questions using the chat function, as I said, and that will really assist us. And now to introduce you to our facilitator for the discussion today, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Catherine Fritz-Kalish. Catherine is a director of, well, Catherine is many things, but for today, she is the director of the International Centre for Democratic Partnerships, and she is the director of the ICDP Foundation. She's also the co-founder and managing director of Global Access Partners. She has 3 children and is passionate about helping those less fortunate. It's my absolute pleasure to hand you over to Catherine. Good morning, Catherine. It's really great to see you today, and I look forward to this dialogue.
Thanks, Simone. Thanks for your kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, a real honour. It's also an honour to be able to interview the wonderful Victor Perton, who I've known for a very long time. And if there's anything that exemplifies Victor, it is optimism, which is quite unusual, seeing that he's a lawyer. But he's also been a politician for a long time. He was also Trade Commissioner in both North and South America. But for the last 8 years, he's worked out that something's not quite right in the world. And then instead of all of us becoming more optimistic, there's a whole lot of people that feel less optimistic. And so he's established the Centre for Optimism and is on a mission to make all of us become more magnetically optimistic. So while I am interviewing Victor, I would ask you to please put your questions in the chat, because there might be times during the conversation that we can ask those particular questions if they're relevant, rather than leaving all of them to the end. And we're really lucky today. We have a diverse group of participants from 9 different countries, including the Netherlands. So it's not only Pacific Island people here, but we have people who run their own businesses, as well as people who are working in companies across a range of different sectors. So let's kick off the interview now. Victor, you've completed some study tours of the Pacific and recently been to Samoa and to Fiji. And in light of that trip and our focus today on entrepreneurs and business development, can you tell us what is your definition of optimism? And in relation to the Pacific, and given their deep ties to community and cultural values, do you feel that your definition is the same as what you've experienced across the Pacific region?
That is a brilliant question, Catherine. And given the faith of most of the Pacific, my favourite definition of optimism is actually almost 650 years old. There was an English mystic called Mother Julian of Norwich, and she lived during the Black Plague, which made, COVID look like a picnic. And her book, for those who are interested, is the oldest surviving book in English by a woman, called The Revelations. And there's a sentence in there that is still the stuff of poetry and song and essays by popes and other people. She said, all shall be well, all shall be well, all manner of things shall be well. So she's in the middle of the Black Plague, you know, whole communities are dying. And she says, look, it's going to work out. And that line she used, Queen Elizabeth, you know, the old English monarch, when she was a princess and gave her speech at the age of 14 to the other teenagers going through World War II, she actually used that line as part of the comfort. So if Mother Julian had lived 650 years, Catherine, and in fact her birthday was a month ago, and Oxford University commissioned yet another choral piece devoted to that line, she could have written the Harvard Medical School definition of optimism, which is a belief that good things will happen and that things will work out in the end.
And Victor, I might just say at this point that in light of what you're saying, I think it is a perfect time to ask Dr. Donna Maria Wate to give our Pacific welcome. Please, Donna.
Hello, Laketa, and welcome to our meeting, a dialogue today, our Talanoa. A special welcome to Victor, who has just we have just started hearing from him, and to all of you, our distinguished guests, facilitators, and participants from all over the Pacific and other parts of the world as well. A warm welcome, Pacific welcome to you all, and this is our prayer from our hearts that today will be a fruitful dialogue, and that each and every one of us will go away with valuable lessons, insights to help us in our various businesses and works of life. Thank you very much, and warm welcome to each and everyone.
And Donna just epitomizes optimism, you know, as a medical practitioner in Honiara, you know, just that glistening smile, you know, just uplifts us. So the Harvard Medical School says optimism is a belief that good things will happen and that things will work out in the end. And I can see a few people in the audience might be old enough to remember the Beatles and John Lennon. John Lennon added to that, if it hasn't worked out, it's not the end. If it hasn't worked out, it's not the end. So optimism is not the same as positive thinking. You know, that notion that there's a silver lining in every dark cloud. You know, bad stuff happens to people. You know, whether it's a death in the family, whether it's a business failure. So optimism isn't all about this notion that there's a silver lining in every dark cloud. But it says if you persist and keep on going, that's the key to success in life, both personally and in business. And in particular, you know, for the entrepreneur or the intrapreneur, whether they're in business, whether they're in social enterprise, or indeed if they're in government. So I've just completed 2 study tours of Samoa and also Fiji. And, you know, it's very, you know, the greetings, of course, Bula and Talofa and, you know, the glistening smile. So the question that arises in my head, you know, there's joy, there's happiness. Is it the same thing as optimism? And ultimately, my conclusion is that it is an optimistic society. And part of that we've just talked about. Faith-based societies tend to have higher levels of optimism. Societies in which family is important tend to have higher levels of optimism. Societies in which people are comfortable to greet strangers, you know, in a positive and friendly way. And it's about resilience. You know, some of the communities that I visited had been hit by hurricane 20 years ago, by tsunami 15 years ago. And they exemplified what the German psychotherapist Viktor Frankl talked about. Some of you will have read his book, Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl survived the Holocaust. And in this book, he talks about a thing called tragic optimism. You know, so it doesn't matter whether you're in a Holocaust or you're in a tsunami or you're in a cyclone or you're living in paradise. the critical thing is to do your best in whatever circumstances. So I put in the chat a couple of the essays I wrote, Samoa Reflections, Liquid Optimism, Fijian Optimism. The Fijian Tourism CEO wrote an essay, and I'd love you all ultimately to contribute your learning and wisdom during this session. So that's a long answer to a simple question, Catherine. Is the joy and happiness and faith and family life of the Pacific translated into optimism? I believe yes.
Wonderful, thank you. We also mentioned in the beginning this concept of magnetic optimism. Can you explain this? And also, how is this useful in business? How do we here draw people towards us? Explain it, please.
Yeah, so generally, as you said, I've been working on this for 8 years of research and teaching. And initially, I focused on infectious optimism. And partly I was influenced by the then worldwide head of McKinsey, the consulting firm, Dominic Barton, who is now the chairman of the world's largest mining company, Rio Tinto. And he said to me that every great leader he'd ever met was infectiously optimistic. But it's not the big man or woman speaking from the podium or, highlighted on the video. He said it's the person who can unlock the optimism in the team. So the boss or the leader can be optimistic, but that doesn't necessarily translate. And I've got my chairman, Rob Masters, on the line. We've now interviewed 40,000 people on what makes them optimistic. Less than 1% mention the boss, less than 1% mention their work, less than 1% mention the Prime Minister or the King, and less than 1% mention the economy. Optimism comes from something within: mindset, faith, life experience. So infectious optimism, as I understand it, is understanding more about the people around you and your workforce and harnessing their optimism for the good of the whole enterprise. And I see that in what you do, Catherine, with your team. You select optimistic people, all of whom contribute. In the case of the entrepreneur, it goes beyond infectious optimism. So you speak to your shareholders, your funders, your customers, your workers. You try and infect them with your optimism. But on this front of magnetic optimism, I've been strongly influenced by one of my board members, and some of you may know him, John Hagel, who for 40 years ran the Deloitte Center for the Edge in Silicon Valley. And of course, Silicon Valley is the beating heart of world optimism. And he said that he wrote a book called The Power of Pull, P-U-L-L. So how in this world, when we're overrun by marketing messages and emails and advertising and product placement in our social media through the algorithms, do we draw people towards us? And so that magnetism comes from, the smile with which you greet people. The magnetism comes from the language in your greeting. And where I come from in Australia, most people greet people with "G'day, how are you?" Now, the Scandinavians think we're absolutely crazy. Why would you ask someone who you don't know, how are they? And the typical answer to that question in Australia is the very miserable, not bad or not too bad. So in other words, you've asked a question, they haven't really listened to it, they haven't really answered it. And just think of the hundreds and hundreds of greetings you've had with an Australian that's been absolutely wasted. And so our experiment was in prison to get the prisoners to ask the warders, what's been the best thing in your day? It was so powerful in changing the power balance between the prisoners and the warders. After 3 months, we were asked to come and train the warders in more positive language. And we've now spread that to hospitals and hospitals across Australia and elsewhere. And wherever it's used, it changes the language. Because if you ask that question of someone, what's been the best thing in your day? 50% of people will give you an answer straight away. You know, the sunset, works great, had a beautiful breakfast, had a lovely lunch. 30% of people will need a little prompter. You know, did you see the sunrise? Did you have a cup of coffee? Give them a little prompter. And 20% of people are actually having a miserable day. And if that, you know, a problem shared is a problem halved. So, you know, particularly in my case of the Australian, someone says not bad or not too bad, there's no permission to ask anything. But if someone says, you know, God, I'm actually having a bad day, you know, can you give me a little bit of help with this, Chris? You know, it is a really, really powerful technique. And sometimes it's something quite intimate and small. I recently did a roundtable such as we're doing in one of the bigger municipal councils in Melbourne, in Hume. And I went round the table. So instead of doing the normal introduction, what's your name, what's your job? We did, what's your name and what's been the best thing in your day? And one woman said, I drove my autistic son to school. He was calm. I mean, we were all just about moved to tears that this little thing in her life was the best thing. But if you experiment, and if I can urge you to do it, the next 2 days, in the beginning of the conversation, what's been the best thing in your day? Whatever comes natural to you, I guarantee if you do it for 2 days, you will do it for the rest of your life. And I now find when I go to the supermarket, you know, the girl with the purple hair, the tattoos in her face, the tattoos on her arm, she grins at me and says, what's been the best thing in your day? And so it becomes very infectious. So, Catherine, this notion of being magnetic is you become renowned for being that glistening, sparkling person at the center of the good conversations. And both Rob and Chris, and I'm sure you've read his work, Catherine, Bill George, the head of leadership at Harvard, who's written the book True North. When I interviewed him and said, what makes you optimistic, Bill? Bill said to me, surrounding myself with positive people. What a blessing. So you want, if we talk about magnetism, you want to be the person that people are asking to be at their table, whether they're thinking about a new business, whether they're thinking about a new social enterprise, or whether it's just a Sunday lunch, you know, and who's the man or woman we want at the table? It's that magnetic, glistening optimist who always asks us that weird question, what's been the best thing in your day?
Yeah, thanks, Victor. I think that's a really practical takeout of this discussion. And we are a community that is that interacts over time. Many of the people on the call now have got relationships independently of just coming onto this call. So I think the type of tips that you're giving us will permeate through everybody's network. And I look forward to having a few more of those tips as the conversation unfolds. But for some people, it's not so natural to be optimistic, and maybe you don't feel so comfortable saying what's been the best thing in your day. So how do we, as colleagues and as peers and managing teams and staff, or even just managing ourselves, how do we become more optimistic and encourage our teams to become more optimistic in a work environment or a business environment?
It's a funny thing. I recently spoke at a very large conference, Catherine, and it was the Intelligent Water Network. So it was 180 engineers, and I had the death seat. I was the 2 o'clock speaker just after lunch when any sane person is having a nap. And the chairman of the meeting, who's a very distinguished head of a water corporation, said, Victor, at the end of your speech, can you do that laughter yoga thing again? So sometimes it's just laughter. You know, it's telling a joke, it's smiling at people. But when we get to the science, I'm actually delivering a program the week after next for the Australian Prime Minister's Department. And I'm going to do 2 exercises with them, and I'll drop them into the chat later, or we can send them out by email afterwards. The Vienna Medical School, you know, in Austria, did a really big study on what helps sleep. And they determined that optimists sleep better, And optimists sleep better, not because they've got less worries. They've got the same worries. They've got the same anxiety, but they're able to put it into context. So they figured out that optimists sleep better, and more sleep makes you more optimistic. So getting that 6 hours or 7 or 8 hours is a good thing. And the intervention they thought was the best for making you more innately optimistic is a practice called My Best Self. And it's on my website. I'll pop it in later. But the principle is you spend 5 minutes, with a drink or a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, and you think about yourself in 5 years' time. Now, in my case, I'm going to be a little bit thinner. I'll probably be a little bit more balding. I hope to still be working in Optimism. I suspect I'll still be living in Australia. And you just think about, and then you spend 10 minutes writing a journal about a day in your life in 5 years hence. Who you're having breakfast with, are you on holidays, are you at work? And you just write for 10 minutes about that ideal day. Did you eat your favorite food? Were your favorite people around you? Now, when I started doing this practice, Catherine, I recommended it as an individual practice to do at home on your own. But as I've gone on and on with it, people love to share it. And I recently did an event for a very big chamber of commerce in Australia, 65 business people. 64 of them wanted to share what their dream was for 5 years' time. So it's a practice, and you can join me. I do it once every quarter online, but I can share. I've got an online version, but it's very powerful. And those thoughts will stay with you. The next time you eat that food, you'll be thinking, I'm on holidays in Vienna, or I'm at work with my favorite people. So that's one practice. Another one that we use is called My Optimism Superpower. And over the 8 years, I've collected 140 types of optimism, from sparkling optimism to charismatic optimism to Pollyanna optimism. And you might have seen I changed my gender pronouns in LinkedIn to become a Pollyanna optimist. Radical optimism. And we get people to just write a paragraph on how that optimism reflects in their life. And I speak at a conference in Brisbane of real estate agents, and they loved it. I went around the room. So everyone in this room, that's a practice you can do at work. So the next board meeting or sales meeting or executive meeting, put on the agenda what makes you optimistic and put the definition on. And you don't do it every week, but once a month, you put it on the agenda and you get the people around you to share it. And people will share remarkable things. Can I share a funny story with you, Catherine? I was asked to help a company get workers to come back from working at home back into the office. And we were on Teams for the meeting, and I went around the room saying, what makes you optimistic? And a lady said, my garden and my pets. And we're all thinking, she does not want to come back to the office. So I said, well, tell us about your pets. What are they? And she said, oh, a dachshund, a canary, and a rabbit. And I said, does your rabbit live indoors like ours does? She looked at me and said, does yours watch television too? I said, mine sits on the ottoman, and she can even switch the TV off if there are rabbit recipes on. Now, we laughed and we laughed, Catherine, but the boss got it. He said to me, do you know, I've never talked to this lady about her garden or her pets. So if I want to make my enterprise happy, joyful, people throwing their best in, I'll talk to them first thing in the morning about their garden or their pets, or I'll bring a rose in from my garden and share it. So those are two things. The third one I'd share, and some of some of the people on the call might already do it. The other thing is a gratitude practice. Some of you will be fans of Stephen King, the horror writer. Every morning before he gets up to get writing, he does this gratitude practice where he meditates on what he's grateful for. and it energizes him and it makes him feel better. So there's two ways of doing a gratitude practice. One is when you're going to bed, have a piece of paper or a pad next to your bedside, and as you're in your pajamas or your nightie, just write down the 3 best things in your day. And they don't need to be huge. It could be coffee, it could be, just interacting with someone, it could be a great meeting, could be a great sales call. And then, of course, if you're sleeping with a partner, this is a really good time to prompt them to be a little bit optimistic. So you say, you lie on the pillow and you say, honey, I'm writing my gratitude journal. What was the best thing in your day? And you pop it in. And then the trick, Catherine, is not just to leave it written in there. The next morning when you wake up, whether you're sitting on the toilet or you're having a cup of coffee or tea, you read back what you wrote yesterday. And, you might sit there for a while. So you might actually flick back a few days. The research from the University of Pennsylvania says that is more powerful than antidepressants. So it's a really good practice. And the other one, of course, is just to say thank you more often. You saw someone today, send them an SMS, send them an email, or, whenever I have a coffee in a cafe, I always go up to the counter and say to the barista, fantastic cup of coffee, and I love the art on the top. So lots of ways. We have 20 practices, but my favorites really are smile and say hello to everyone, change your greeting, laugh more, my best self, and then be grateful.
Wonderful. Thank you. That's so practical. I have a question in the chat from Shirty, which really was asking, how do you make negative people around you more positive, or if the environment you're in isn't really conducive to being positive? I think you've given Shirty and the rest of us some really practical ways to influence our environment so we don't feel that we're the only optimistic voice in a sea of negativity. As an entrepreneur, and really just as a someone in the work environment, we need to know how to innovate, to be flexible. And there's this idea of optimists being more able to be innovative. But why is it that the pessimist cannot innovate?
I'll come to that in one moment. Let me just answer Shorty's question first. Okay. Really tough. If you're surrounded by pessimists and you can't control the environment, that's really tough. And I was in a meeting 2 days ago where someone confronted me and said, I'm not optimistic. And we then had this very animated discussion on the value of optimism. And afterwards, a couple of the other board members came up to me and said, oh, God, we're glad you engaged in that. We actually understand optimism more. So, Shorty, one of the things I did in New Zealand was to do 2 sessions at the tax department. And if ever you've met a group of people who don't even like to say they work at the tax department, it was that group. But doing what we're doing today and sharing some of these gratitude practices, we actually established 2 little groups of optimism ambassadors. So the trick is, if you've got toxic people, negative people, there's always that person leaning over the table, ready to say but to what you're thinking about, Shirty. The trick is to get the optimists and the positive people around you, have that coffee and march into the room united in positivity. Now, the other trick is also, can you ask the pessimistic person to actually do a report on something optimistic? So let's say there's an opportunity for the firm, get them to write the report on the opportunity and see if they can turn their pessimism into an opportunity. Now, Catherine's question is really important for every entrepreneur and business coach.
Can I jump in here?
Go.
I just want to check. Chris, did you have a question on that topic? I thought I saw you put your hand up. No? Okay, let's keep going. Victor, thank you.
The science, there's some really brilliant science on this. There's a company out of Canada that's interviewed something like 200,000 people on their work attitudes. And they say the science is that a pessimist can't innovate. And the reason the pessimist can't innovate is that they are ground down by what goes wrong. So if you're an innovator, you'd have to be Jesus, wouldn't you, to get it right the first time, right? Most innovation requires us to experiment. let's try this, let's try that. Well, it's working okay, but can we change it? Whereas the pessimist is ground down on what went wrong with the original thing and who's at fault. I'm at fault. And my favorite example is Dyson. Does anyone here have a Dyson vacuum cleaner? You know, the bagless vacuum cleaner. Dyson famously had 5,000 models of the bagless vacuum cleaner before he achieved commercial success. 15 years of trial and error and ultimately success. Now, he's a billionaire now and he's got 3 innovation centers around the world. But the trick for you as an entrepreneur is all about trying new things. An entrepreneur is all about trying to sell new things. An entrepreneur is all about looking for the next opportunity. So when you're employing people, you know, and you want them to be innovative, don't just ask them, have you ever been involved in innovation? Actually, in the interview, ask them about their optimism. What makes you optimistic? What makes you optimistic about the Solomon Islands? Or what makes you optimistic about Fiji? Give me an example of where your optimism and persistence led to a positive result. Now, it's very rarely asked in interviews, although I did one of these sessions and a lady put her hand up and said, my boss asked me what made me optimistic. And she'd been a great success. So innovation, you want, exactly if we go back to Shorty's question, there's a billionaire in Australia called Twiggy Forrest who says he won't have a pessimist around his board table because he can hire them for $600 an hour from law firms and accounting firms. So what he does is, you know, it's basically a skunk works at the board. You know, we're all thinking innovatively. We're not saying but, we're saying and appreciative inquiry and then once we've got the proposal up, we can get the lawyers to have a hack at it. We can get the accountants to have a hack at it. You know, we want the yin and the yang. We want the critics, you know, like the Dalai Lama. You know, he is taught from age 5 how to have tough arguments on Buddhism. You know, it's not all about, you know, meditating. So we've all got to be tough. We've all got to be resilient. We've all got to be prepared to argue. But when you're doing innovation, when you are the entrepreneur, you know, when you're taking new products to the world, you need to surround yourself with optimists and then test the proposals with the critics and the experts who are good at looking at negative risk. But, you know, a lot of companies, Catherine, when they do their risk register, it's all about minimizing risk. But risk has a spectrum, positive and negative. And you and your father know this really well. You know, you've got to be looking for the opportunity and you've got to be aware of the downside.
Thank you. I would encourage everyone, please, to put some questions in the chat and then I'll ask you to ask them. In particular, if you can think about times maybe when optimism has meant the difference between being able to achieve something and not being able to achieve it. So having that faith, if anyone has some examples of that, we would love to hear those today because those inspire other people. We have a question from the chat. Leo has put it in there and I would love to ask Leo to please ask that question if she's available. Is Leo there?
Hey, yeah, of course. So I was wondering, how do you stay optimistic when everything around the world just keeps kind of showing you that humans tend to be negative and tend to not see the positive side or just do terrible things? And how do you keep staying optimistic when the future kind of seems doomed with the environment and everything? Yeah. Thank you.
I'll try not to, I do have an hour-long speech on this one, Leo, so I'm not going to do that, but I'd love to talk to you more on this question. So number one, the news is a very small selection of the worst stories in the world. And There's a wonderful book, if you want to read it, written by a Swedish doctor called Rosling, called Factfulness. And Factfulness, and there's also an Oxford University site called The World in Data, shows that the world is always getting better. You know, medicine is getting better, human health is getting better, it's more peaceful, the worldwide murder rate has dropped, the worldwide violence rate has dropped, starvation has almost disappeared except in war zones. So one thing to do is to listen to the news less and be more selective in the news that you let yourself to. So it's, the question is, who do you let near your brain? But then secondly, I mean, take for instance, now the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So I just hug my Jewish friends now. You know, you've got to, so people feel grief in these circumstances. And so in grief, the optimist listens to people. You know, we let them express their grief. You know, let's say someone's died in their immediate area. Now, you know, the language is not that they're in a better place. You know, people don't want to hear that from you, but they do want you to listen, and they do want you to share some of the better memories. So when I look at Israel and Gaza now, when the war is over, as every war will be over, what can I do? What can we do to make it better? And it's interesting, I've got a number of friends who said, Vic, you know, Israel needs you. I suspect Gaza, you know, will need us too. So it's how do we rebuild? So there will always be terrible things that will happen in the world, but the overwhelming experience of life is that 98% of it is good. And so we've got to attune ourselves to that. And particularly as an entrepreneur, one of the real tricks, and that was the challenge Catherine put out before she asked this question, is you have to share the good stories, right? You know, the Fiji Times, you know, the Samoan Bugler, you know, the Australian newspaper, they are not going to lift you up. They somehow have an ideology that says that they're going to drag us down and make us feel miserable. So we often talk about, I don't have, which I won't do it now. Our symbol for the Centre for Optimism is a beacon, right? And my challenge to you as an entrepreneur is to be a beacon of optimism in the fog of pessimism. And the new president of Singapore, Tharman, is a wonderful man. And last year, while he was still campaigning, he said that the biggest public policy issue in the world is the collapse of optimism. That all of us have to work to build optimism. So, you know, when I think, you know, Chris, what he's doing with his coaches and the like, is the trick, Leo, I should say, the trick, Leo, is for you to share more positive stories. So use LinkedIn, use Facebook, use Twitter, use TikTok to tell your stories, but also those stories of your customers and your suppliers. So if you're in, you know, a business producing, you know, we were talking about breadfruit earlier, you know, there's a new breadfruit product. Share the story of the grower, share the story of the wholesaler, share the story of the retailer, share the story of a consumer who's got something good to say, and lots of 1-minute videos on your social media, or your press release to the paper, or your interview on the radio. Whenever I do radio interviews, it always goes overtime. Because once you get people talking about the good stuff, they just love it. So Leo, you know, if you spend too much time watching the news, you're going to be dragged down. So the trick is 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes at the end of the day, but the rest of the time have your ears open for the good stories you can share, and your mouth open with the good stories you can tell.
Thank you, Victor. We've got a few questions coming through now, and I'd encourage everyone to post them. Interesting question from Chelsea. But before I go on, I have to say, Donna, I can see you nodding at almost everything that Victor is saying. So if there's a comment you want to make, something that you feel is really relevant to what you're going through, please let me shine a light on you so that you can ask that or make that statement. But Chelsea, are you happy to ask your controversial question?
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I'm cautious not to be the party pooper, but I'm just sort of wondering how sustainable can optimism be, especially for people that maybe it doesn't come naturally to. And as Leo pointed out, there are a lot of terrible things happening in the world right now. So is there ever a time where it's okay to be a little bit pessimistic, even if you're alone or with, you know, close family and friends, just to acknowledge sometimes things are really hard, and is that healthy to do?
Yeah, there's a professor of molecular psychiatry at Deakin University, and she gave me my favorite ever answer to what makes you optimistic. It took her 18 months to answer my question, and she woke up in the middle of the night and sent it to me. She said, optimism is the evidence of dreams not yet realized. And her view is that pessimism and optimism may come from different brain centers. So if you think of the biology and the structure of the brain, it may be that pessimism comes from one bit that's related to alertness and fear, and optimism comes from that part of the brain where you're more likely to experience joy and happiness. And you know the brain science, the brain is like any other muscle. Whichever bit you exercise more will grow more. So in all of us, there's probably a bit of pessimism. In all of us, you know, there's optimism. And if you're an entrepreneur, you're more likely to have exercised the optimism part of the brain. Yeah, look, optimism, the best definition of optimism is that it's a state of mind, not the state of the world. So I can be optimistic 100% of the time, but there are times when I'm angry. There are times when I'm frustrated. There are times when I'm sad. There are times when I'm shocked by something that someone has said to me. And that's different from being pessimistic. You know, it's normal to have grief. It's normal to be angry. It's normal to be frustrated, but you can still believe that things are going to work out. So two of the real estate agents in that conference I talked about in Brisbane, they weren't even sitting next to each other, both got up and said, I'm optimistic as a reaction to my parents. My parents were so miserable and so negative. I just couldn't stand it. And from the day I left home, I decided to be an optimist. So personally, you know, there will always be pessimists around you. You know, there's 9 billion people on Earth. The science says about 25% of them are naturally pessimistic, 25% of them are naturally optimistic. So you're always going to have those pessimists around. But if I go back to Bill George, you know, the head of leadership at Harvard, he says you want to try and surround yourself with positive people. But you know you're going to have to visit that grandmother, you know, who whinges all the time about young people aren't as good as they were in her day. Or, you know, that you know, the world isn't as safe as it was in her day. Steven Pinker, who's the head of psychology at Harvard, he says anyone who remembers the good old days has got a bad memory, right? Anyone who remembers the good old days has got a bad memory. You know, I'm a man, you know, 50 years ago, the average man died at the age of 55, right? I'm almost 65. I've outlived my father and my grandfather by nearly 20 years. You women, you know, are outliving your ancestors by 20 and 30 years. So, Chelsea, I'd say there's always going to be a role for pessimism because some people make their business through pessimism. You know, television news is all about pessimism and fear. Radio news is about pessimism and fear. The big 4 consulting firms, the Deloittes and the like, you know, win their business by telling you your business is crummy and your management is crummy and your workers are crummy. You know, pay our partners $5,000 a day and we'll fix you. So your question, I'm sorry I'm going on and on and on. I think you can be optimistic all the time, but the reality is for all of us, you know, there's this little muscle in the brain that pushes the pessimism. In my case, there's a bigger muscle in the brain that pushes the optimism. And let's keep trying and working that one. Because if I'm an entrepreneur, in business, in social enterprise, or in government, I'm going to draw people towards me if I'm optimistic. If you think about all the great leaders in the world, men and women, they glisten, they sparkle, they attract people towards them. Sorry, Josh, I can go on and on and on, but that's my thinking. What do you reckon?
Yeah, thank you. I think that makes perfect sense. We have to be able to feel all the feels, not only be optimistic. Chris, you've made an interesting point. I would invite you to tell us a little bit about who you are and where you are, and where your statement comes from, and if you have a question for Victor relating to that comment.
I hope you can hear me okay. I'm
Yeah.
surrounded by positive people. I haven't really got a... I think it's a very positive message. I think it's really important that we all realize this is not a new message. This message has been packaged for a long time, and we do it in different language and different ways. And I think that's my worry, is that if we overpackage something, then it becomes just hype, and the world's full of hype, and people stop listening to it. So I think it's really important. I mean, there's no entrepreneur in this world that can't manage unless they do believe that they can achieve. In my comments, I think from the Pacific point of view, it's interesting that lots of people look at the Pacific and they see wonderful beaches and they see wonderful smiling people. Yeah. And they don't necessarily see into the culture, which is incredibly challenging, particularly for younger women or younger people, into the religion. And it's interesting, Victor, I mean, you mentioned the word faith, I think, once, but religion is a powerful issue here, yes? And it's an issue that we often don't like to get in and talk about. You know, we don't want to talk about religion or politics, do we? But it seems to me that these are really key issues. And of course, in the Pacific, we're talking about young countries. So we've still got the legacy of colonial thinking. So all these things are going to make it bloody difficult to be optimistic and to be positive. But I agree with you. I think our job is to help people be resilient. And the only way people are going to be resilient is to start putting in some proactivity in their lives. And that has to be linked with the messages that are coming out here. So I haven't really got a question there, Catherine, but it's great listening to it. But let's all remember that this is not a new message. And we have to find ways. I think we have to find ways in our lives. I mean, the most optimistic people I think I see around are kids. Kids are totally optimistic. And what happens to them when they grow up? We beat the bloody optimism out of them. And they become frightened. And we end up with cultures of fear. And isn't that a shame?
Yeah.
Isn't that a real shame? Sorry, I'll stop.
No, I don't want
don't
you
be
to stop.
sorry, Chris.
I would like you to just explain to the group what you do, and just a little bit about yourself, so that people can get some context around you.
Sorry, who, me?
Yes, you. Just where are you based?
Okay.
What is your business or your two businesses? Just so that we get to know you a little bit. We've got some time.
Okay, so I live in Vanuatu. I'm a Kiwi. I've lived in the Pacific 7 or 8 years. I left school when I was 16. I'm 77 years old. I spend all my time helping people be the best they can be. In Vanuatu, we're building up a whole notion of entrepreneurs and people to support entrepreneurs. And it's really cool. And it's nice to see Donna on here, and I've done a lot of work in the Solomons. And I think it's really good to have these conversations and actually use them to challenge some of the tough issues as well. Is that enough?
Yeah, that's great.
So
you might want to pick up on something that Chris has said, or I can move on to the next question. How do you want to play?
I think Rob would be very well equipped to respond. But if I could just briefly, Chris, when you and I were young, the news was 50-50 good, bad. You know, the point that Chelsea made. Harvard University's tracked the change in news culture. so that the news nowadays is nearly 98% bad news. You know, the end of the week, they'll give you one story about a fluffy animal. So when we think of young people, in fact, young people tend to be very positive, but they haven't had the experience of failure. You know, it's often the first broken romance at 16 or the first failed exam at age 18. Older people actually tend to be more optimistic. And there was this lovely woman in Shepperton, in country Australia, Catherine, who died last year at the age of 107. And she was interviewed by the television news a year and a half before that. And they said, "How have you lived so long?" And she said, "Well, I remain optimistic." She said, I always know I can't change what happened yesterday, so there's no need to worry about yesterday. And no matter what I do today, the sun will rise tomorrow. And so oftentimes we become more optimistic through life experience. But your point, spot on, Chris. I had the honor of having an audience with the Dalai Lama last year. And he said the most important thing we can do is to maintain young people's optimism and hope. But we can't tell them to be optimistic and hopeful. We have to model it. So exactly as you say, the message is not exactly new, and it's more important than ever when, as Chelsea says, you know, we're being terrorized by the news. We're being made fearful by the news. We're made worried and anxious. And men of your age and women of your age, your wisdom is just vital.
Thank you. Charlotte, you had a question that was related to something that Chris mentioned, which is, you know, the role of religious theology in different communities. And across the Pacific, we understand that faith has a huge impact and power across the Pacific. And so if you'd like to ask your question, then we can relate that to the people here.
Yeah, awesome. My question is, so how do you see religious theology, in particular Christian theology, work in tandem with optimism? Do you think that there is a place for religion and optimism to really align and work together, or do you think they kind of they don't work together? Yeah,
it's a really great question. I did a tweet yesterday where I disagreed with the Pope, so I'm probably going to get excommunicated because the current Pope is South American, and he sort of thinks of optimism as sort of Yankee language, and keeps talking about optimism being a shallow human emotion and hope being very powerful. And I put in the chat a page there on Christian optimism, which when I published it on the web before I was heading for my first trip to Samoa this year, got 15,000 likes and reactions. Nearly 10% of the Samoan population. So when you look at Christian optimism, the evangelist Billy Graham said optimism and cheerfulness are products of knowing Christ. St. Jose Maria Escriva said Christian optimism is not a sugary optimism, it's an optimism that sinks its roots into an awareness of our freedom. So it depends on which branch of Christianity. So the Protestant churches and evangelical churches tend to emphasize optimism more. And it's optimism through belief in God. Roman Catholicism is divided. Did you ever see the film The Two Popes?
Yeah, I have seen it, yeah.
So the German Pope was very much an optimist. So remember I mentioned Mother Julian of Norwich?
Yes.
He did this magnificent sermon where he lauded her for her leadership as a woman. And 650 years, her words still come through. The current Pope almost has the opposite view. So Catholicism and Anglicanism don't tend to be as clear. And then when you move to the other religions like Sikhism, the Sikhs, they in their religion actually have an edict that says, be positive, be optimistic.
Wow.
So, and Islam, of course, has two lines. I've got a wonderful resource on Jewish optimism which if you give me 30 seconds, I will just find you. There's a couple of beautiful quotes, including a couple of funny ones on with Jewish humor. So Rabbi Lookstein said, "To be a Jew is to be an optimist." But I'll just find you that little joke.
While you're doing that, I might I think I didn't ask Rob Masters to speak when he had something to say. So
You're going to stop me telling jokes.
No, not at all. I don't think you did tell jokes. I just wanted to give you some time to search them up if you needed it. Otherwise, continue, and then I'll give Rob some airtime after.
And Rabbi Telushkin said, "Jews are optimists with worried faces." So it comes back to you, Chelsea. You can be an optimist and still be worried. And that great leader, the Secretary of State under Clinton, Hungarian lady. I can remember her name. Secretary of State Clinton. She said, "I'm a worried optimist. I always know things are going to turn out, but I'm allowed to be worried along the way." Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Victor. I was just going to pick up on a couple of things that Chris and you were saying, Victor. Climate of Fear, if anyone has read the book, there are a whole lot of books on climate of fear going into climate change and various other things. But if you read the psychology behind climate of fear, it's worth getting that book. And it picks up on what Victor was saying, and to a certain extent, Chris, with the media. The media is a negative base tool because, if it bleeds, it leads is the famous newspaper quote. And I come from a journalistic background, so everything had to have a negative base. Unless you're writing a feature type story or a colour story, you could then turn it into a positive outlet. But most news is negative base, so just keep that in mind. But one of the big things that we've been doing at the Centre of Optimism is looking at the whole of strategy and the objectives of strategy today, whether it's government or whether it's a business corporation. When you put your objectives down, you always have those as a base of optimism. You want to achieve something in the objectives, and the tactics that you go about achieving them, this always has a positive approach to it. So you don't go into a strategic plan, a policy plan or anything these days without focusing on a positive outcome. So it's there in your day-to-day business, the way you operate. It's just a matter of you turning your mind into that optimistic approach. So when you start to do your plans in the future, think of the optimistic opportunities, or think of the opportunities that you're trying to achieve from those objectives in a positive, optimistic way. One last thing, Churchill, and I've read a lot about, in the Second World War, his overall purpose was to win the war. It was as simple as that. And then he set about a strategy which was to win the battles on land, sea, and water. And then he set his objectives about how he was going to do that on land, sea, and water. And his tactics formed that as well. Everything was based on optimism. And if you read his writings, and especially during that war period, all his broadcasts as well, they were all based on optimistic outlets. That's how he led the community. That's how he led the outcome of the war. So he gave people a purpose. And picking up on Chelsea's point before, where you are surrounded by negativity, if you're going to be a leader, you have to have a positive outlook in life, and that's an optimistic outlook. So I hope that gives you some thought.
Thanks, Rob. And look, running my own business, I think you're right. For all of us that run businesses, or for all of us that are working in jobs, you have to think positively, otherwise, you'll be unhappy a lot of the time. But Victor, where is that line in the sand beyond which you need to maybe stop being so optimistic about an outcome. And I'm thinking of something really practical, you know, pursuing a customer or pursuing the development of a product or a service, you know, always thinking, oh, it'll work out, it'll be okay. And I've had this from my own personal experience. Sometimes you actually have to let things go and say, well, that didn't work out. Where's the line in the sand?
Well, that's not between optimism and pessimism. That's just, you know, really good business practice, you know, and you know, we've actually had a big go just on, rather than a product, on a business policy issue. The Australian government's got a new measuring what matters, so-called wellbeing budget. And we thought that optimism was a no-brainer. You know, and the Prime Minister was talking about optimism, and, you know, we went in with a first submission. We met the people who were running the show. We went in with a second submission. We did absolutely everything they asked of us. And when it was published, the only mention of optimism was in the index, the people who had made the submission. Now, we're having a second crack at it, and we've just done a research project on what makes Australians optimistic about Australia. And, you know, I'm going to try and meet the treasurer and meet people running it. You know, if it doesn't get up this next time, we're going to put it on the back burner. You know, and so I think, you know, whether it's a product, you know, at one stage, our people thought it'd be really good to sell mugs with "I'm an optimist." You know, we sold 60. Right. You know, so, and then it just stopped. You know, so, you know, look, it's still on the website, and if someone wants a mug, you know, we'll produce one. But we just stopped advertising it, and we just stopped pushing it. So I think in our space, it's been interesting. So T-shirts with optimism on it, mugs with optimism on it. Yeah, they haven't gone so well. In my book,
I'll buy one because it's my husband's 50th birthday, and he is even more of an optimist than you. So I will purchase one.
I will get it across to you. When's his birthday?
The 8th of December.
Good. I'll get it to you before then.
Thank you.
But, you know, like funny other stuff work. You know, like we have a bath mat with what makes you optimistic on that. And that one we sold several hundred. You know, it was that one was a good one. You know, we're not doing, you know, our programs have worked in prison, they've worked in schools, they work in corporates, but we're not getting much traction from schools. You know, schools tend to be overrun now with these organizations that are teaching them negativity. You know, the Are You OK organizations, Beyond Blue. So the depression organizations tend to have had a much better say. So again, you know, we'll do the odd school if they ask us, but it's not one of those things we're pushing. So we see that in our optimism enterprise. You know, we're stronger going to hospitals and medical facilities than we are going into schools. Now, we'll keep persisting. We've got a great school program. But, you know, you put your effort where the return is.
Yeah, and I think you're talking about medical programs. I look at Donna again, and I think, Donna, all day, every day, you're probably trying to infuse some optimism into your patients who are facing really difficult, you know, times. So, Donna, I am wondering whether you can share how you remain optimistic and how you might infuse that optimism into the people that you work with.
Right. So now I'm not so much of the clinical practice, but I'm working with women in the community who are, yes, they're most often pessimistic. Even my own family, they're so pessimistic in so many ways, but I try to be the optimistic among the people that I surround myself with and also work with, especially with the community. And yes, I think it starts from for me, starts with me, me as a person, with one person, and then working through how I speak to them and how I share what I'm optimistic about, what I'm hopeful about, what I believe, and my faith. Although yes, I can say that from a religion of Christianity, and I'm an Anglican. I can see that this like with the generation of my parents, they at this moment they are so pessimistic. So I think it starts with me. So I try to be more optimistic now, doing some of the tips that Victor has shared. Those are the kind of things that I do on a daily basis, so that I can be more optimistic and share that optimism with others, and yes, to achieve our goals and all the objectives that we have for ourselves as well as the business goals. We really have to be optimistic. So that's for the bigger picture. But in terms of clinical practice, I think all the medical people will really need to have like a boost of continuous optimism, refresh things like this to help us. Yeah.
Thank you.
Often, yes.
I think that comment that it starts with me, which you threw away as such a, you know, a small comment, is something that we will all take from this interview. I think it's really important to take that responsibility. I would like to get a photo actually of everyone, and I know there are some people that can't or are unable to put their video on because then they can't hear the broadband, or the bandwidth doesn't cover picture and sound. So for those people that are on the call, I'm wondering at some point in the next 5 minutes, if you can turn your picture on, that would be great, and then we can get a screenshot. Victor, did you have any other thoughts that you wanted to share with the group?
I was just listening, of course, then to Donna, you know, what I did in Ipswich Hospital and what I've done at Epworth Hospital. I'm happy to come over and let's do a face-to-face. One of the things, you know, as you know, my son is 18 and studying Pacific politics at ANU, and we walk the streets in Solomons, you know, and Samoa and Fiji, and ask people, you know, about their lives and what makes them optimistic. So I'm really happy. You know, I think if the challenge is there, if Donna and I can do it for some of the medical practitioners and the like, I'm happy to put in the effort and do it together. And so for me, it's just been a huge joy. You know, when people say to me, what's been the best thing in your day, Catherine, you can imagine it's this.
Wonderful. Are there any other comments or questions that we have for Victor at this point? Any thoughts?
But you're all welcome to stay in touch. You know, a question, doing something together. You know, what you guys have put together here in this partnership is just absolutely fantastic. Such interesting people. Such good people, such uplifting people. I'm deeply, deeply, deeply grateful to have been adopted by you.
Thanks, Victor. Thanks for your time and for sharing your wisdom, for improving all of our lives in the process. Donna, thank you for doing the welcome and for speaking with us about your experiences. And Simone, thank you for being a wonderful leader and support, and for the incredible work you've done over the last 6.5 years to build this, you know, wonderful network of Pacific Island people. Is there anything else? Simone, have I forgotten something?
No, I think it's been fabulous. I just wanted to thank you both for making the time to be available today. I'll speak on behalf of everybody else, but I found it fantastic. I'm going to walk away from today with, I've got a bunch of things that I can do straight away, which will, you know, change me and hopefully those around me to think a little bit more positively about things and be a bit more optimistic. So I think that's a fabulous outcome. And Victor, I look forward to working with you and continuing the collaborations going forward. That would be fabulous. I think, you know, people across the Pacific are generally, I find them more optimistic. I don't know why. I mean, maybe it's in their DNA, but I love being around people that are optimistic. So I think this will be fabulous. Thank you. And I wanted to just a quick thank you to Charlotte because she put all this together. She did the
That's what I was going to
background stuff. And of course, we've got a short survey. So we'd be delighted if you could respond and give us some feedback, things that you liked, things that you'd like to see differently, and maybe some opportunities for some future dialogues and themes. So thank you.
I would like to just shine a spotlight on Charlotte. She's 4 weeks into the role. She's done a wonderful job. There were 43 people that responded to attend today. That really is a fantastic outcome. So Charlotte, you've done really good. Well done. Thank you. All right, everyone, have a wonderful rest of your day. And if we don't see you before end of the year, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and just look after yourselves. Yeah, be safe.